I'm Bryan Hartson, and welcome to the Bryan Hartson Show. Always a pleasure to have you with us. We have a great show with a friend of mine here today. Before I get started, though, I do want to open up with our birthday wish. Today, our birthday on the list is Becca Marie. Becca, congratulations on your birthday. Thanks for being a part of the show, and thanks for joining us. And today, we have a very special guest, Phil Mews. And Phil is from County Durham in the north of England. And at 7, Phil lost both of his parents in a 10-week period of time. And he was then shortly sent off to boarding school for another 10 years. Since then, Phil's organized a book called Orphan Boys, which tells his story. And the book has become an Amazon bestseller and has sold thousands of copies around the world. Now, Phil has an extensive television career as a producer for over 20 years and has been nominated for a British Academy Award, BAFTA. Now, Phil is working as a writer and as a speaker on bereavement and empowerment, using his story and his experience to help others try to cope with the loss of grief. Phil, I want to thank you for joining us today. And it's always a pleasure to have some great speakers on with us, and you have quite an extensive history with producing. So, how are you?
I'm very well, Brian. Thank you very much for having me on the show today.
My pleasure.
I'm coming to you from a rather cold and wet north of England, but still a very beautiful north of England. So it's lovely to be speaking to you in the US today.
What time is it over there about right now?
It's 6 p.m. in the evening, so
okay.
We've already had our Monday pretty much.
So how's my day going to go? Because it's only 10 o'clock in the morning out here.
Oh, I think if you get better weather than us, you'll be fine. We've had rain, we've had wind, and we've had even a little bit of snow today here, which is very, very rare for May. We're used to sunshine at this time of the year, so everyone's suffering a little bit with the British weather.
Wow. Okay. Now, Phil, you've got a story to tell us that's quite extensive. It goes back, nearly 45 years, if I'm not mistaken. Back to 1976 is when things started really happening for you. Can you take us back to 1976 in the picturesque dales of North England, as I think it is properly pronounced? 2 young brothers. Tell me about it.
Yeah, so there was myself. So in the summer of 1976, let me tell you, it was the hottest summer for years, for at least a couple of generations. And it was this long, hot summer. And I was 6 years old, and my younger brother Roger was 4 years old. And we lived on the farm with our parents, Harry and Elmer, and our elder brother Richard, who was 16, who was working on the farm with our father. And it was an idyllic summer. We had the most beautiful place to live. We grew up in this 12th century farmhouse, just packed with history, beautiful setting, a river running through the farm. We would run off and have wild adventures and climb trees and play in the river. And we would come home when we were hungry. We had a lot of freedom. It's something that's reminiscent of the Huckleberry Finn and Tom Sawyer books, I think. It was beautiful, beautiful. And we just had a lovely, lovely life. And then 18 months later, in November 1977, I went to bed one night, kissed my dad goodnight, and at 3 o'clock in the morning, I woke up and I heard moving around in the house, and I shared a room with my little brother. So I left him in bed and got up and went through to my parents' bedroom. And my mother was sat on the bed crying, and I asked her what was wrong, and she said, "Darling, your daddy's just died." And I was at that point, yeah, my life changed, and I think, to be honest, at that point, a chunk of my childhood disappeared, and I had to suddenly grow up, as any
And you're
child does, going through
and you're the oldest of the two brothers, correct?
There's three of us. So Richard was the eldest. So at this point, Richard was 18. There's an age gap, and then I was 7, and Roger
Gotcha.
was 5. So Dad had left behind his wife. Dad was only 52 when he died, and he left behind his wife and 3 boys. My elder brother, who he'd been training to run as a farmer to run the family farm,
Mhm.
and yeah, so it was horrific. It was horrible, and we had to deal with it. And I persuaded my mother, much against her better judgment, I persuaded her to let me go and see my father's body laid out, because we had this huge, big old house that was this old manor house that we lived in this on the farm, and there was a dining room at the one end of the house, and that's where they traditionally laid somebody out when they died. It's a bizarre British tradition,
Mhm.
and the next day I persuaded her to let me go and see him, and that actually left me mentally scarred for the best part of 40 years. I suddenly had nightmares within a few days. I would dream that, as a kid of the 70s, that my dad was the ghost in Scooby-Doo coming to chase me. And that's what played out in my head, which sounds ridiculous, but to a 7-year-old, it's terrifying. And
Mm.
these night terrors went on for the best part of 40 years. So my mother we had to deal with dad's death, and we had to get on with it. 10 weeks after my dad died, my mum, she drove me to school one morning, dropped me off, gave me a kiss goodbye, and that was the last time I ever saw her. She took ill that afternoon. She went to a friend's house. She wasn't very well. They called an ambulance. They took her to the local hospital. And that night, she died of a heart attack, and she was only 43 years old. So
Wow.
that was the point where Roger and myself and Richard, even though I was 18, we became orphans. And that's the word that people used on that first morning, the next day, how to describe us. Um,
Did you know what the meaning of the word orphan meant at that time?
I'd heard of the word, and I always associated it with Oliver Twist, or, I was aware of Oliver Twist, the Charles Dickens character.
Uh-huh.
I knew Little Orphan Annie, Annie the musical. So I knew those stories, but they were children who had nobody, whereas we still had 2 amazing grandparents,
Oh,
my aunt Brenda, my cousins. We had a large extended family, so we had a lot of love and still lived in our lovely home. And we didn't have nobody. We weren't like Oliver Twist and Annie. So from that respect, we didn't see where that term was relevant to us.
mhm.
And my grandmother went on for years to use that term to describe us. And I absolutely hated it. Absolutely hated it. So at the point when I came to write the book, Orphan Boys, I was determined I was going to use that word in the title and take ownership of it.
Wow, quite a story. So you were orphaned, but not really orphaned, because grandma and grandpa were there to raise you. Did that looking back over that time, uh, do you think you were in a better position with grandma and grandpa raising you, or and now you went over to boarding school for a decade too, didn't you?
Yeah. So what happened was, according to my grandmother, about a week after my mother's funeral, there was a knock at the door. and it was the authorities. I don't know who they were, social services, we might call them here. Now, I don't know how this had come about or how it happened, but apparently they said, we think the boys, the two younger boys, Roger and I, would be better being taken into care, because my grandmother at this point was 70 years old, just about, almost 70, and my grandfather was the same age, and my grandmother had just recovered from a massive stroke the previous year. And obviously in 1978, 70 years old was considered to be a lot older than what it is today in
True, yeah.
2021. So there was concerns clearly somewhere about the welfare of my brother and I. I don't understand why, but my grandmother wasn't having any of it, and she physically chased these people out of the house. She literally physically chased them out of the house, and she called a friend of hers who was a lawyer, a family friend, and he made some phone calls. And that afternoon, my grandparents were sworn in as legal guardians of my younger brother and I, and another family friend who had been a member of the local Masonic Lodge with my father. And they came forward and said, we're going to put together a plan. We would like to send both the boys to boarding school from when they reach the age of 8 years old until they are 18. And it won't be too far away from home. And that will enable the family to stay together. So they'll be able to come home every few weeks for the weekend or a week or summer holidays, Christmas, Easter, and live with grandma and granddad on the farm. And that was an amazing lifeline that was thrown to us by this Masonic charity, and one that my grandparents grabbed with both hands. Of course, they wanted to keep us boys at home and all the family together. And thank God they did. Thank God they did. We were really lucky, and we knew we were lucky. But then 6 months later, when I went to go away to boarding school, and by now I was 8 years old, it was tough. I'd never been away from my family before in my life.
Mm-hmm.
I remember on my second night, I think I cried the first night, and then I remember the second night being in the dormitory with all this rows of beds. It's like everything you see on TV. And I remember crying, sobbing my heart out. And I remember one of the boys who was in charge of that dormitory took me downstairs to see the house mother. Now, the house mother was not a kind lady at all. She was very much... she was like Miss Hannigan, but without the alcohol. she was not a nice person. And she said to me, you know, they called you by your surname. You weren't allowed to use your Christian names. So it was Mews. You know, my name was Mews. I wasn't allowed to be called Philip, which was such a horrid thing anyway. Mm-hmm. But she said, Mews, you just need to snap out of it and grow up and be a man and not be homesick. And what I couldn't tell her, because I couldn't, if I said anything back, it would be classed as back answering. I wasn't homesick. I was grieving. And there's a big difference. And that was what set me aside, I think, from the other kids. I accepted I was away from home. I knew that. I got my head around that because I knew it was essential for our family to remain together. Mm-hmm. But the fact the reason I was crying was because I was grieving.
So your grieving actually set in well after the passings.
It was instant. No, the grieving was immediate, but I think it just carried on. It just carried on, and then this was another element. So for me, it was I've lost how my life had changed. You know, by the time I went to boarding school, it was not even a year after my father's death. So I'd gone from living this lovely life on the farm with my parents and my two brothers, and my grandparents would come and visit, and all our friends. And suddenly I was in this strange place, living in a dormitory with 6 other boys in this one dormitory, but 21 of us in the boarding school, in the little boarding school, who were boarders, and living with and being cared for by strangers away from my family and my parent, knowing I'd never see either of my parents again. And also at that point, I remember I was starting to realize I couldn't remember what my parents' voices sounded like. I think it was about 6 to 8 months afterwards. The memory of their actual voices started to fade away. And because we have no video recordings or audio recordings of them, and I haven't heard their voices since 1977, 78, I don't remember what they sounded like. I couldn't tell you what their voices sounded like. I don't remember at all. But I'd actually realised that was happening at the time. And that was really traumatic and tough to deal with.
Yeah, you were right at that cusp. My understanding is that age 6 is a pivotal period of time in a person's life for development and memory. So you just got over that. It sounds like you had it, but it went away. It lost it a little bit, huh?
Yeah, and poor Roger, he was only 5, and he didn't remember them so well, and that really troubled him, and it troubled him right the way into adulthood. It was heartbreaking, and he a lot of the time he wouldn't talk about them because the thought of it upset him too much. And it was tough. It was really tough.
Phil, thank you so much for being with us. On the other side of the break here, we've got a lot to talk about still, including the writing of a book that I want to dig into. Some happy stuff there. So stay with us. We'll be right back. Hi, and welcome back to the Bryan Hartson Show. I'm Bryan Hartson, and we are in the middle of a conversation with Phil Mews. And Phil has had quite a bit of a life, if you will, from an early age of 10, moving into, being an orphan and then going to boarding school and producing for over 20 years. Now he's an author, a motivational speaker, and he's with us to talk more about himself and his book. And I do want to remind you, you can hop on over to the website, www.bryanhartson, BRYANHARTSON, Hartson's Heart, HARTSONSHEART.wordpress.com. Pick up your merchandise for the Bryan Hartson Show. That would include things such as a wonderful polo shirt or a t-shirt. You can get the 2021 hat, and of course you can grab the 2021 new logo mug. So hop on over there, help support the Bryan Hartson Show. And again, I want to welcome back our guest, Phil. Phil, thank you for being with us. Thank you for taking the time in the UK to spend with us in the evening before it's time to turn in for the evening. You've been talking with us about your life, and you've got quite a life to talk with us about. And I don't think we're going to pack it all in on the show, but I do want to know what you think about your community, and tell us about the community, how they popped in to help you and your brother.
The community was just amazing. We were attending, at the time when my parents died, we were attending a very, very small Catholic primary school. We're not Catholic, but my mother thought it was a better environment for us to be nurtured and learn. And we had this little local school that was run by nuns, and there was 30 kids in the entire school. 30, that's it. And it was run by these 2 nuns. This lovely nun called Sister Mary de Pazzi was there at the time when my mother passed away, and she helped my grandmother hugely in terms of easing that transition and getting us back to school after my mother's funeral, and just keeping an eye on us, really. So like my birthday, that was a couple of months after my mother's death, Sister de Pazzi would say, let's have the party at the school for Philip rather than at the house, because that was the tradition. You had all the kids around your house and they ran riot. She thought it would be easier for my grandmother if we had it at the school, so we did that. she was instrumental in helping. My mother's sister, my auntie Brenda, was just a powerhouse of support for my grandmother. And my grandmother always said she couldn't have done it without my auntie Brenda. She was there. I mean, she was heartbroken. It was her elder sister that had died, so she was going through her own grief, and yet she stepped in and basically was my grandma's right hand person to help bring us up. And of course, Grandad and Richard was my elder brother was so busy. He'd now taken over the running of the farm. He was only 18. He did amazingly well because there was a lot of scrutiny on him, I think, and there was a lot of farmers and friends kindly watching him, but I think he felt very scrutinized. But he did a remarkable job. I think everyone just pulled together. And where we lived at the time, which is where I live now, I've moved back, was a village called Stanhope in Weardale in County Durham, and it is beautiful. Imagine if you've ever seen the British TV show All Creatures Great and Small. That's what the landscape looks like. It's filmed just an hour down the road. It's a beautiful rural landscape where communities are tight-knit. They really do come together. So even now in 2021, when someone passes away in the village, there's always someone going to go around to the family's house with food. It might be
good old tradition.
Well, it's what I think they think is it's a practical way of helping. It shows love and care, and it's also saying, look, you've got so much to deal with right now. But acquiring food, buying groceries is one thing we don't want you to have to worry about. So here's some meals for you, and you can concentrate on dealing with your grief and dealing with your relationships. So it's an amazing community. And then even the community of the school, you know, as much as I don't always paint a positive picture of what happened at boarding school, I'm glad we went. And it was a good school, a really good school. And I was there for 10 years. And, you know, that was the deal. I had to stay till I was 18. And, yeah, school days are never plain sailing. You know, there's all the things that come with life in a boarding school in England. So similar to a life in a high school in America. You know, there's tribes form, and there's the stronger ones and the weaker ones. Some kids get picked on more than others, and that's just life, and we had to get on with it. But it was a really good school. It gave me a good start in life.
That's good. Now, I know that growing up, you had another issue that you had to deal with, and that was your own sexuality, right?
Yeah.
So why don't you just give us a brief understanding of that? Because it had to have been tough, not only back in the day, dealing with your own sexuality, but then the world back then, where it was and where it is today, has been quite a huge transition. So I'm sort of teasing, but go ahead and tell us about that situation.
No, I mean, they always called me a sensitive child. I think that was it. I knew when I was about 14 that I was maybe attracted to boys rather than girls. And so imagine that was 1984. It was the AIDS epidemic had just broken through in the UK. There was a lot of negative press. It was Thatcher's Britain, so we were the Mrs. Thatcher's government had created this awful law that made it illegal for any schools or teachers to discuss homosexuality in a positive light with children in the UK. This section 28, it was horrific and incredibly damaging. So it was a really tough time to get your head around, not only as a 14-year-old coming to terms with your sexuality in your head anyway, but also looking at the wider world in terms of, you know, all this negative press that would come through on newspapers and television, like the AIDS epidemic, the adverts on the TV against warning people about AIDS, salacious tabloid stories, and then that official thing of Margaret Thatcher's government telling us, you know, it was something second rate. So I just got my head down and just got on with it, and didn't really deal with it. And I had girlfriends, and I thought, God, at least if I'm walking around with a girl on my arm, I'll throw everyone off the scent. And then I think I got to the point where I was late going to university. So I was 21 when I went away to study. And I think then I ended up spending a summer in Australia, visiting a good friend in Sydney, and stayed with her. And we went traveling. And I ended up going to my first ever gay bar when I was in Sydney. And I knew that that day my life changed and I couldn't come back to the UK as the same person. So eventually I did get round to telling most of my family, and coming out, and they were very accepting. I think they were quite shocked, some of them. I'm not sure why, but they were shocked. But I was very well supported, and I've been with I'm married. We had to fight for equal marriage here in the UK.
Sure.
I've been married since 2007 to my wonderful husband, Martin. And we've been together 20 years this year. And Martin...
Congratulations on that.
Thank you. Thank you. And my family were just amazing. Our wedding was amazing. And to be accepted, to come back into the community that I essentially ran away from as a 22-year-old, 23-year-old at university, to come back into the village 25 years later or whatever, with my husband, and to be 100% accepted is just it's wonderful. It's wonderful, and I feel like my life has come full circle in a way.
Well, congratulations.
Thank you.
Congratulations to you both.
Thank you.
Now, Phil, your brother Roger recently passed, correct?
Yeah, Roger died 4.5 years ago. Nobody saw it coming. I was speaking to him one weekend on the phone. So Roger lived in Mallorca, which is one of the Balearic Islands in the Mediterranean part of Spain. And Roger had the most wonderful life out there. He was a really successful DJ, incredibly popular. And in the last year before he passed away, he got his own radio show on Radio 1 in Mallorca. It was a big deal. And it was a huge success. And it had just been commissioned for a second season. And I was talking to him on the phone one morning, and he was absolutely great. And 3 days later, I got a phone call to say he'd been found in his apartment and he died from a brain hemorrhage, a brain aneurysm.
Wow.
Gone. It was instant. And we were devastated. And that's 4.5 years. And you can see I'm still incredibly raw. And in many respects, that's been harder to deal with than losing my parents. It really has. Roger was, along with my husband, Roger was my best friend. And, the three of us, the three brothers, Roger, Richard, and I, we're all being very close in many different ways. And he was the person who lit up the room. He had this quality that he would just light up the room, any room that he walked in, and he could connect with anybody. And it didn't matter if they were homeless or if they were a major celebrity. Roger could speak to them all and connect with them all on some level. And that was a remarkable ability that he had. And all these stories have now since come out, since he passed away, about his kindness and how he looked after people and got kids to fill in university applications that when they were, maybe indecisive about going on to study, and he made sure they did it. And got friends work. He lent people money. He fed. There's a homeless guy on the island that apparently he bought them breakfast every morning for years. Just bought them breakfast every morning.
So it sounds to me like there's a book of memoriam coming out from you. Maybe.
Well, you never know. I mean, it's a hard thing to write, but I think I always say to friends when you lose someone, at first there's going to be a lot of tears. That's only natural, and we did with Roger. We have cried, but now we're starting to remember him with smiles rather than tears. And I always say it's a long process. You know, some processes take longer than others,
Mm-hmm.
but we do remember him with smiles because he gave us a lot to smile about.
That's awesome. Now, you are an accomplished author with being a bestseller on Amazon. Let's see if we can pop this up here. This is the book, is it not?
Yeah, this is it. So this is Orphan Boys. This is the book. So I'd started to write this in 2015. And on the day that I decided to write it, I phoned my two brothers, Roger and Richard, and said, this is what I want to do. It's a little bit out there, but how do you feel about that? Do I have your support? And unequivocally, they both said, yeah, go for it, do it,
Mm-hmm.
tell the story. And so as I wrote the book, I consulted with both my brothers during the writing of it. And it was bittersweet when it came out because Roger passed away about 3 months before it was originally released. And I would love to have seen it because I know how proud he was of me for writing it and for telling our story and for
Mm-hmm.
getting it out there. But the reaction to the book around the world, I've had some wonderful correspondence from people in New Zealand, Australia, in India, and a lot in the US and Canada, just a huge amount. And it really seems to have resonated with the American audience.
Mm-hmm. Well, I'm looking forward to reading more of that book. I did pop up here. We've got where any of our listeners can go to pick up more information about you on Facebook. Down on our ticker at the bottom, we've got your Twitter, your Facebook, your Instagram. There's no excuse for anyone not getting a hold of you, right?
Absolutely, absolutely. And you know, over in the US, you've got Amazon, you've got Barnes and Noble. They are stocking Orphan Boys. They are being very kind, and they've been incredibly supportive of this book. And I've a lot to be thankful for with the American audience that's got behind the book and supported it all this time.
Awesome. Phil, I want to thank you again for being on the show. Real pleasure. I hope I get to get you back on again real soon if I can
Oh, that would be
find
amazing.
a bit of your time.
You're welcome. Thank you so much for having me.
You're welcome. And thank you, ladies and gentlemen, for joining us for the Bryan Hartson Show. We have a great show coming at you tomorrow. I'm going to encourage you to stay on top of the Bryan Hartson Show. Go to Real Bryan Hartson on Facebook. You can watch it live, as always. Again, thank you, ladies and gentlemen. Have a beautiful day. And remember, today is the first day of the rest of your life. Make it great.